You have 5 minutes to sign over your hotel empire, Madison, or I'll have my legal team file for an emergency conservatorship. I'll have you declared mentally unfit to manage your affairs by sunrise, and I will take control of Apex Heights myself." My father didn't even blink as he threatened to lock me away just to steal my $920 million company. He thought he was holding a gun to my head. He did not realize that I was the one holding the bullets. I sat in the dim, oppressive dining room of his Palo Alto estate, where the air was thick with the scent of a $5,500 bottle of Cabernet and 3 decades of his cold-blooded tyranny. Welcome to Turning Table Stories channel. I'm sitting here with a warm cup of coffee, watching the view and reflecting on the hidden battles families often fight. A quiet moment like this is a sharp contrast to Madison's high-stakes reality. Where are you listening from today, and what are you drinking? I'd love to know. Now, let's return to the tension building at that dinner table. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I didn't even summon the energy to be angry. Anger is an expensive emotion, and I was through footing the bill for this family. I just reached into my bag, pulled out a check, and slid it across the mahogany table until it tapped against his wine glass. The amount was written in clear, sharp ink, $284,600. "The debt between us is settled, Jeffrey," I said, my voice as cold and clinical as a pathologist performing an autopsy. "That is every cent of the tuition you've held over my head for years. Our contract is terminated. I don't owe you a single breath anymore." Jeffrey stared at the check, his mouth opening and closing, like a fish on a hook. He was used to the old Madison, the scared 24-year-old girl he had thrown out 5 years ago, for the crime of loving a man he couldn't control. He had locked the iron gates of this estate in my face, and called my husband, Jackson, a parasitic thresher who was merely playing with crayons. He had cut off my trust fund, my health insurance, and my dignity, waiting for me to starve so I would come crawling back to his shadow. He didn't realize that hunger is a hell of a motivator. Jackson and I spent 2 years living in a studio apartment that smelled like damp plaster and failure. We slept on a mattress on the floor and ate instant noodles while we renovated our first boutique hotel with our own bare hands. Jeffrey thought he was breaking me, but he was actually forging me into the person who was about to dismantle him. People often wonder why children of narcissists ever agree to show up for family dinners after years of abuse. They don't understand the phantom reflex, that invisible chain that makes you crave the approval of the person who spent your life tearing you down. It's a biological glitch, a desperate hope that this time they'll finally see you. But standing in this room, I realized the chain was gone. I hadn't come back to Palo Alto to be a daughter. I had come to perform an audit. For 5 years, I worked until my hands bled, just to buy my own immunity. I was no longer a person to him. I was a balance sheet he had spent decades overdrawing. Jeffrey wasn't looking at a daughter. He was looking at a predator who had finally learned how to hunt in his woods. Jeffrey didn't pick up the check. He just laughed, a wet, ugly sound that rattled the ice in his glass. "You think $12,000 buys your freedom, Madison? You think you can walk out of this house and take nearly $1 billion of my legacy with you?" He leaned forward, his eyes drilling into mine with a predatory glint. "Beginner's luck is a dangerous drug. It makes amateur girls think they are actually businesswomen." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a second document, sliding it over the first. "This is a family intellectual property clause, Madison. It's an ironclad agreement that any innovation, software, or brand developed while you were under the Sterling Capital umbrella belongs to the family estate." He took a long, slow sip of his wine. "Apex Heights was built on the foundation of the education I paid for in the house I provided. Every line of code in your hospitality software is legally mine. I've already contacted your underwriters. The moment I file this, Your $920 million initial public offering is frozen. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was trapping me in a legal cage he had spent months constructing. I looked at the document, then back at him. He looked triumphant, a man who had just played an ace. I looked at my mother, Kimberly. She sat to my right, twisting her linen napkin until her knuckles turned white. She would not look at me. Her silence was a loud, clear signal. She wasn't my protector. She was just the silent investor in his version of family. Across from her sat my brother, Tyler, staring intently at his phone, his silence a practiced defense mechanism. He was the golden child who had learned early on that as long as he didn't look up, he didn't have to witness the blood on the floor. He was a ghost at his own dinner table, waiting for the storm to pass. "And what about the draftsman?" Jeffrey asked, his voice dripping with that familiar condescension. "Is Jackson still playing with his crayons while you do the heavy lifting?" He always called my husband a draftsman, spitting the word like it was a slur, refusing to acknowledge him as a visionary architect. Jeffrey viewed Jackson as a parasitic casualty of my rebellion, someone who deserved to starve along with me. 5 years ago, these threats would have made me shrink into my chair. I would have stammered, tried to defend our life, and begged for a scrap of his approval. But tonight, I just watched him. I didn't feel anger. I watched him with the quiet, calculating stillness of an architect measuring a condemned building. I wasn't there to argue. I was there to survey the wreckage before the demolition began. He was no longer the giant I feared, but a structure whose foundation had already turned to dust. He wasn't a king holding court. He was a man who had borrowed too much time and had finally run out of credit. I let the silence hang in the room, heavy and suffocating. I wanted him to feel the weight of his own arrogance. He thought he held the leash, but he didn't realize that his family intellectual property clause was a forgery of a ghost. He thought he was bullying a daughter into a bailout. He didn't realize who was actually sitting at the table. My compassion had been a luxury. He'd overdrafted for 29 years, and tonight I was finally closing the account. I watched him. I didn't blink. I didn't even breathe as I focused on the microscopic tremor in Jeffrey's hand while he tipped the decanter. The crystal neck rattled against the glass rim, a sharp, rhythmic tapping that betrayed the terror he was trying so desperately to mask with arrogance. He set the bottle down with a heavy, clumsy thud, trying to hide the shake, but I had already seen it. He wasn't a king holding court in his Palo Alto fortress. He was a cornered animal, baring its teeth because it had no other defense. I felt the cold, clinical detachment of a pathologist looking at a tumor. I wasn't just sitting across from my father. I was sitting across from a decaying legacy that had finally run out of time. "Beginner's luck is a dangerous drug, Madison," he repeated, his voice dropping into a register that feigned a fatherly concern. "It makes amateur girls think they are actually businesswomen. But the world is full of people who will eat you alive the moment you show weakness." He leaned back, and the smell of wine and arrogance rolled off him. He truly believed he was the puppet master, the man who collected sins and used them as leashes to keep the world in line. I let the silence hang between us, heavy and suffocating. "You talk a lot about weakness, Jeffrey," I said, my voice cutting through his panting like a blade. "But let's talk about yours. Let's talk about the $45 million in toxic debt currently due. You think that's a small number for a dynasty like yours? You've forgotten your own contracts, Jeffrey. That loan contains a cross-default clause. The moment you fail to pay this, every other creditor you have will legally be allowed to freeze your accounts and demand full repayment of your entire billion-dollar debt portfolio within 48 hours. The color drained from his face so fast, it looked like gravity had stolen it. He sagged into his heavy oak chair, the sound of air rushing out of him like a punctured tire. He stared at me as if I were speaking a language he had never learned. This was the moment of narcissistic collapse. The instant the tyrant realizes his vault is empty, and his shadow no longer scares the birds. You see, men like Jeffrey build their entire identity on the illusion of power that a thick wallet provides. They don't have character or integrity, they have assets. Their authority is a suit they rent with interest, and their respect is a service they buy on a monthly subscription. I realized then that his power was never real. It was an elaborate performance, staged on a foundation of shifting sand. When the bank account hits zero, the dictator becomes a beggar. His status was just a layer of gold leaf over a rusted soul, and I was the one who had finally peeled it back. "How do you know about that?" he rasped, his voice thin and diminished. "That is confidential information. Sterling Capital is drowning," I interrupted, my tone flat and lethal. "You didn't invite me here for a reunion, Jeffrey. You invited me because you saw my $920 million valuation on the news and saw a life raft. You thought you could bully a daughter into a bailout because you've spent 29 years convincing me I was nothing without you." I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto his. "But you forgot one thing. You taught me how to find leverage. You taught me that hunger is the best motivator. While you were drinking $5,500 bottles of wine and checking my credit reports to watch me break, I was learning how to buy the very ground you stand on." He lunged for his wine, his breathing ragged and desperate. He looked small in his expensive suit, a mean old man who had borrowed too much to buy an affection he never earned. The illusion was shattered. He wasn't holding a gun to my head. He was just holding an empty decanter in a house that was no longer his. Jeffrey stared at the binder on the table, as if it were a bomb about to detonate. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out, just the ragged, uneven panting of a man who had finally realized he was out of room to run. The realization washed over him in a slow, terrifying wave. He wasn't sitting across from a daughter he could bully with fake doctors and rigged psychological evaluations. He was sitting across from the only person in the world who could destroy him. "You took out a $45 million bridge loan 6 months ago from a private equity firm called Cerberus Capital," I said, my voice cutting through his silence like a scalpel. "It was high interest, short-term, and backed by your personal guarantee. Most importantly, it was secured by 51% of your voting shares in Sterling Capital. By defaulting on this single note, you didn't just lose $45 million, you triggered the collapse of your entire voting trust. You've handed me the keys to the castle because you were too arrogant to read the fine print." Jeffrey's face went a sickly shade of gray. "That is confidential." "How do you know the terms of that note?" "Cerberus Capital was looking to offload their high-risk debt last week," I interrupted, leaning back and watching him struggle to breathe. "They thought you were going to default. They thought you were a bad bet. So they sold the note for pennies on the dollar to a shell company. I own that company, Jeffrey. I own your debt. And most importantly, I own the default clause." The air in the room seemed to vanish. I didn't feel a single grain of guilt. I felt the cold, clinical satisfaction of a debt collector closing a file. "I am calling the loan," I said, each word precise and final, full repayment. $45 million due immediately. Jeffrey shot up so fast, his knees slammed against the heavy mahogany table. Silverware jumped, and his heavy oak chair crashed backward onto the floor, with a sound like a gunshot. "This is fraud," he bellowed, spit snapping from his mouth, his face darkening to a sickly purple. "You can't do this. I'll tear it up. I'll bury you." He lunged for the binder, his hands clawing at the pages, as if destroying the paper could erase the reality. "Dad, stop," my brother Tyler shouted, jumping up as a crystal decanter was knocked to the floor, exploding into glittering shards. "Sit down!" Jeffrey roared at him, his eyes wild and bloodshot. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I simply picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over a pre-drafted message to my lead counsel. One word: execute. "Go ahead," I said, my voice slicing through his frantic panting. "Tear it up, burn it, Eat it if you want. It doesn't matter. I hit send. Jeffrey froze, pages crumpled in his trembling fists. He looked up at me, chest heaving. What did you just do? That binder is just a courtesy copy, I said, locking my screen and setting the phone down with a deliberate click. My legal team was waiting for my signal. They just electronically filed the confession of judgment with the county clerk. It's officially time-stamped, Jeffrey. The debt is called, the default is registered, and the process is now irreversible. By the time the sun rises, the world will know you've lost control. I stood up, smoothing the front of my dress, as if we were discussing the menu for next week's brunch, rather than his total collapse. Under Uniform Commercial Code Article 9, a secured creditor can seize voting rights immediately upon default. To protect the asset, I whispered, stepping around the table until I was directly in front of him. He smelled like sour wine and the cold, metallic scent of fear. I'm the creditor. I just exercised that right. I own your shares now. I control the board. I control the building. I control you. Jeffrey's phone started buzzing in his pocket, then my mother's, then Tyler's. An ugly little chorus of alerts announcing the end of a dynasty. That's probably the board secretary, I said, my voice steady and unbothered. They've been notified of the change in control. That is the official notification for the emergency board meeting. As the new majority shareholder, I've already moved for your immediate removal for cause. You're not just retired, Jeffrey. You're being purged from the legacy you thought was untouchable. He looked at his screen as if it were written in a language he had never learned. He was no longer a giant. He was just a mean old man in a tailored suit who had borrowed too much to buy an affection he never earned. He turned to my mother, his voice a pathetic rasp. Kimberly, tell her this is insanity. But my mother didn't move. Usually, she would jump in to soften his rage, but tonight she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at me, with eyes wide with awe. She was doing the math in her head, realizing the daughter she had pitied had just taken the crown off the king, without breaking a sweat. There's one more thing, I said, letting the words settle over the room like a heavy blanket. I reviewed the collateral agreement you signed for that $45 million loan, Jeffrey. You didn't just pledge your shares. You put up the original deed of this estate. My mother's glass slipped from her hand, splashing water across the mahogany. Jeffrey went gray. He hadn't told her. He had secretly gambled away the roof over her head to cover his bad bets while pretending to be the patriarch who protected us all. He wasn't just a bully. He was a criminal who had betrayed his own wife's security. I don't want the house, I said, reaching into my bag and pulling out a set of keys, sliding them toward my mother. It's already in your name now, Mom. I've secured your interest. But Jeffrey, you have 30 days to vacate. I built this office! I built this life! Jeffrey screamed, a raw, broken sound. It was the last gasp of a tyrant, out of ammunition. And you leveraged it to cover your pride, I replied. My team audits the books on Monday. If I find 1 cent of misappropriated funds, I won't just fire you, I will prosecute you. I picked up my purse. I expected to feel heavy, crushed under the enormity of what I'd done, but I felt light. I felt weightless, as if the air had finally returned to my lungs after 5 years of holding my breath. I walked out, my heels clicking a steady, clinical rhythm across the floor. You ungrateful witch, he bellowed behind me. I made you. You're nothing without me. I didn't stop. I didn't even turn around. You don't look back at a burning building once you've made it out alive. The night air hit my face, cold, sharp, and clean. For the first time in 29 years, the oxygen finally belonged to me. 3 months later, the dust had finally settled. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the corner office at the Prudential Tower, looking out over a city that felt entirely different now. The air in this room no longer smelled like vintage wine and unspoken threats. It smelled like fresh paint and possibility. The brass letters on the office door had been changed. Sterling Capital was a ghost, replaced by the sleek logo of Apex Hospitality Group. My assistant knocked softly, The architects are here for the renovation walkthrough. Madison, should I send them in? Give me 1 minute, I said, catching my reflection in the glass. I looked the same, but the scared girl who used to stammer at this very table was gone. I reached up and touched the pearl earrings I was wearing. They weren't new. They had belonged to my grandmother, the only heirloom I chose to keep from that house. My mother had mailed them to me a week after the dinner, with a short note saying she would have wanted me to have them. I didn't wear them for sentiment. I wore them as a quiet, physical reminder of the truth. Legacy isn't something you inherit by blood. It is something you build by choice. Jackson walked in a moment later, rolling out fresh blueprints across the mahogany desk that I had refused to replace. He looked up and grinned, his eyes full of the same steady support that had kept me upright for 5 years. Ready to build something new? He asked. Always, I whispered back. Sitting there, I realized that I had finally broken the chain. I have come to realize that some people spend their entire lives waiting for an apology that will never come, or a seat at a table where they are only ever viewed as a resource to be harvested. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember this. Walking away is not an act of betrayal. It is a final act of self-preservation. When the contract of loyalty is repeatedly breached by those who are supposed to protect you, you are no longer just a daughter or a sibling. You are the architect of your own freedom. Firing your family is perhaps the most difficult professional decision you will ever make, but it is also the only way to reclaim your sovereignty. Forgiveness does not always lead to a happy reunion. Sometimes it is simply the clinical act of closing a bad file so you can finally start a new project on your own terms. We are building a community of people who realize their worth is not defined by the name they were given, but by the life they built brick by brick. If this story showed you that it is okay to choose yourself, hit the share button. Like and follow for more stories of justice and resilience.